Hello, everybody. We hope there's plenty of you out there listening in for our third Hangout on Air, which is come as part of our Migration Shared Endeavour. A number of us who are members of the Society for One Place Studies have been working this year on a migration project. And if you're a member and you go to our website, you can access the resources that we've put there, some inspiration sheets, some book lists and other ideas. Now it's time for us to share some of those ideas with you. So if you want to join in, you didn't have to have started in January, you can go back at any point as a member and look at that part of the website. So we're going to begin by Kim and I sharing a little bit about what we've found, and hopefully that'll give people some ideas, and then we're going to open it up to anybody else to share things as well. So you just have to excuse me while I start screen sharing, which I can't do like that. How does that look?
That looks good.
Right, and I will hand over to Kim for this first part with some of the results of what she's been discovering since January.
Hello everyone, my name is Kim Baldacchino and I'm studying Bratton Clovelly, Devon. Most of you have probably heard of Bratton Clovelly by now, but it's a big parish of 8,000 acres or so in the southwest peninsula of England, and it sits just to the west of Dartmoor, which takes up a good chunk of the lower middle part of the county, and it also sits quite close to the border with Cornwall and the River Tamar. So tonight we wanted to talk about what we've found so far in our migration study, and I'm going to concentrate on the internal migrants of Bratton Clovelly. Basically, I don't know if how many of you remember, but I got off to a flying start on my migration study and went through and studied the context and figured out my key questions and thought about my sources. And I posted quite a bit of my initial work on the Google Drive that those of you who are participating in the TOTA shoot, who are participating in the project, have access to. And if you don't, just send me a note. And some of you may remember that I decided the way I'd go about it was to start linking between censuses. So I took the Bratton Clovelly census and all the residents, and then I looked at the next census and I started figuring out who was in both censuses, who linked together, who was new, who was disappeared. If any of you have tried to do that, you're well aware that that's a really can be a really time-consuming task. And it wasn't that long until the year before I was really pressed for time because I was taking a diploma course, advanced diploma in local history. And I started really getting a little nervous and trying to figure out how in the world was I going to get through all this linking to find out who my migrants were, so then I could find out more about them. But all of a sudden I got this big break in my course where I got to actually work on this as part of my last assignment. I felt really lucky that we were going to make really good progress. What I did to that, though, was I said, okay, I'm just going to focus on the period 1841 to 61, and that's the period we'll talk about tonight. Okay, I'm ready for the next start. Okay, let's see, let's get that up on the screen. Okay, so here was my challenge. Bratton Clovelly is a rural parish. I mean, it's really rural. There's really nothing but agriculture in Bratton Clovelly. It's got the sea to the north, the sea to the south, and the sea to the west, but everybody in Bratton Clovelly works in agriculture. There might have been a few blacksmiths or shoemakers, but not many. So Bratton Clovelly has taken off in growth like many places in the first part of the 19th century. And all of a sudden, by about 1841, it just started to plummet. And between 1841 and 51, the population of that parish dropped by 20%. while overall the rest of them are right on growing. It did stabilize for a while after that, but as you can see on the graph, eventually it just kept going down further. I haven't quite gotten that far, but what I wanted to really find out was what caused that 20% drop that you see from 1841 to 51. So I linked together all the people that I could find who lived in the Valley between in 1841, 1851, or 1861. And it came out to about 1,500 unique people. There was more people that showed up the population of the state census to census. I also found that while doing that, this is part of what took all the time, was that 1841 was a really big challenge because, as you know, there's not birthplaces, there's not relationships, there's really some really key things missing in the 1841 census when you're trying to figure out who migrated, where they come from, and where did they go to. So I found that I also start linking to and tracking down baptism records, which took quite a bit of time, but really helped me to identify who these people were, especially if they had more common names and the like. And as I moved along, I went ahead and linked in things like marriages, burials, tithe records, wills, and anything else I could get my hands on to try and understand more about these people. So eventually I could figure out why they were moving and why they were moving where they did. So for this presentation, I'll show you what I found overall first. We had a quick chart. And you may have charts like this for your places too, but basically there's only three ways of population constraints: fertility, mortality, and migration. Basically, people are going to be born, people are going to die, or people are going to move. And I'd add another category, especially if you're working with the 1841 census, which says people you haven't got a clue what happened to them because you couldn't find them, or you couldn't distinguish them from the other 20, John Rice out there. So I made a chart of what was going on between 41 and 61. And in each decade, I looked at who stayed. I looked at all the ways that people complete the parish, whether through death or as out migrants, or they disappeared, but I could not track them down. And the same for people who came into the parish with births and migrants. And also a few unknowns. Really fewer unknowns run out. And I only had immigrants or overseas move for people who left the parish. I didn't have essentially anybody come to my parish from overseas as an arrival. And I looked at the same for 1851. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the that are labeled out migrants and in migrants. The immigrants are an interesting story, but I've still got more information to find on them. I think I'll be talking more about them at our upcoming conference. And I did check out the births and deaths, but I quickly figured out that in my parish, the birth and death rates are very similar to the overall rate in England, and therefore there were more births and deaths, and that really wasn't going to be part of explaining why my population dropped by 20%. So the biggest number of migrants that affected my population were actually the internal migrants. By internal migrants, I mean studying a place in England, I really mean those migrants stayed within the British Isles, but in the case of my little place, almost all of them stayed either right within the county of Devon or maybe wandered, a few miles over into Cornwall. But other than that, I think in 20 years I had something like 6 total get out of both Devon and Cornwall. So I'll talk mainly about quite local migration. Okay, next one. So what did I do first? For the out migrants and the in migrants, and actually for all the kinds of migrants, I looked at and tried to understand the different characteristics of the people. So the analysis, I did a little analysis, and I'm not going to go through all these numbers, I promise you. But I kind of tried to look at what were these people like. I looked at their sex. I found that the vast majority of them were very young. In fact, most or many were dependents, and most of the rest were young servants in their teens or early 20s, but certainly young before marriage. I found that things like people who had not been born in Breton Valley, that had moved previously, were more likely to move again. More people who were not born in Breton Valley who were moving on from the parish than those who were born there. And I found that virtually, or the very large percentage of both the in-migrants and out-migrants came from within 20 miles, certainly, and most of them even within 5 miles. So this was incredibly local migration. The other thing I found was that almost the vast majority of my migrants came from or moved to another village or hamlet. So there's a lot of talk at that time in England of all the people starting to move into the cities. And there's even one of the early migration people who came over the theory of migration, Reagan, said that, oh, the great goal of everybody out in the countryside was into those great economic centers of towns and cities, but that really wasn't the case for my guys. They were going very close to home and finding work, other work in agriculture in villages and hamlets, just like Breton Valley. So that was really interesting, and that told me quite a bit about the group I was dealing with. And Janet, if you go to the next chart, I took a closer look at where they went to and where they came from. And that was also interesting. I found, again, they, as I said, they came from a very local area. And it was particularly interesting to me to see that for where they went to was mostly to the southwest, certainly west and southwest of Breton Valley. And that was especially interesting to me because there's a fellow who did a field study on a nearby parish, North Lou, back in the 50s. And he found the same thing with the migrants there, that they mostly moved to the southwest of North Lou. I don't really know yet why that is. Maybe that suggests it might be the geography, because there are some more lands up there. And but the other possibility is that the River Tamar is quite nearby in that southwest direction, and that's that river that divides Cornwall and Devon, and it's quite a commercially important river. So maybe there was something that maybe there were more opportunities or perhaps more settlements down in that area, but I'll have to look at that some more. But you may find patterns like that that others find as well, and just try and think why did that happen, because there's not anything that is consistent about the villages and hamlets to the north or to the east either. So anyway, I found that interesting. To go to the next chart, the other thing I tried to look at was, okay, well, how did this population drop really take place? So I had an idea of who was moving in and out. It's obvious that in the decade between 1841 and 51, more people moved out than came in because I got the big population drop. But I had as many migrants in the 1851 to 61 period, even though the population didn't change, just at about a number of people came into the parish as left the parish. And I should have mentioned that it was a huge amount of movement. There probably were, if you took all the internal migrants together, you got just about the same total number of people as all those people stayed. So it was a lot of movement. And what really surprised me was when I started looking more at the people's occupations. And I found that in that 20-year period, when a 20% drop in population took place, the total workforce in that parish only changed by 4 people. I think it went from something like 312 to 316 or something like that, which absolutely shocked me that it could take that kind of population drop and essentially have no impact on the overall workforce. The other thing that really surprised me was because everybody was saying, oh, it's because everybody's moving into the towns and cities and stuff. And because agriculture was under some pressure, I expected the number of farmers to drop, the number of agricultural laborers to drop, and they didn't. They actually rose slightly, at least in the adult workforce. So even to this day, you've probably got about the same number of farms in that parish. And so those numbers stayed the same, but what did change radically between 1841 and 51 was the number of young servants. Now that came back and stabilized in the following decade, but that's what absorbed all the, that's what reflects virtually all of that population change. More young people went out of the parish of service than young people came into the parish. It really came out almost that simple. What really surprised me, it showed that those young people were really absorbing the impact of all that growth in the early part of the century. So that was really a big finding for me that I had not expected at all. And Janet, if you go to my last slide. Hello? Oh, okay, I just summarized what I found. I had about 50% growth in the early part of the century, and basically I think there were just too many people to feed on the land and the jobs and work that were available in the parish. As big as it was, it's not feeding land, it's clay and it's pasture land and the like, and still a lot of moors and the like, so we just couldn't absorb it. And fundamentally then, more people went out of the parish and came into it, and they went to other places very nearby, either in West Devon or just over the border in North Carolina. They were young people, and they didn't have to go far, and they were picking up the same sorts of jobs. They weren't just coming in, they weren't going to towns and stuff. For the most part, they were picking up the same sorts of jobs that they learned from the service within the parish had they been an opportunity. The adult work was almost exactly the same, and the agricultural, the people working in agriculture, the adults working in agriculture, were even like in and by 1860, the servants had almost returned back to that same level. But since the parish was much smaller then, there was a higher number of residents working. And one other change took place through that time where the females, there was quite an outcry about female agricultural workers and the fact that maybe that was putting things into them. I don't know. There was a lot of hoopla about females working in agriculture at the time. And all of the females, all of them in my parish, had been farm servants in 1841, and they were domestic servants in 1861. Other than that, there really were not that many changes. There were a few more. There were more females working in different sorts of things like dressmaking and the like, but there was no alternative industry developing. But otherwise, everything was very much the same as in 1841. So that's what I found.
Right, well, thank you very much, Kim. I thought what we'd do is that I'll do my little presenting bit, and then we'll discuss all together, because there's a certain amount of things that are going to not exactly overlap, but there'll be similar things that are going to come up. For the benefit of those of you who perhaps haven't listened to Kim and I on a hangout before, my places are actually also in Devon, further north than Kim's, and what has been interesting for us about this project is there are certain areas that we can compare and find quite similar patterns. So I'm not about to just repeat what Kim said. If you want to know about this in more detail and why we think these people were moving, particularly why they were emigrating, you'll have to come to the conference in November, because Kim and I will be doing a double-handed presentation there, looking at comparing my places, which are further north than hers. So what I thought I'd do today is something a little bit different, which we've put on the new inspiration sheet, which has just gone out about the migration shared endeavour. And one of the things we've suggested that you may like to do in connection with movement is actually look at the people who didn't move at all. So this is something that I've done for the places that I'm interested in, and look not just at those who are moving, but why is it one section of the population that's moving and not another. So I have done a little bit of work on the people who stayed put. So I'm just going to give you some ideas of what you might be able to do with your places if you wanted to. You can have a look at how long a surname remains in your place. So you can look at a parish register, you can look at a census return if you've got them, you can look at directories, wills, and track the longevity of a surname in your place. What you have to be careful of is that just because someone of that surname is baptised in 1700 and also appears in the 1901 census, the same surname, it doesn't mean necessarily, A, that those two people are related in the first place, but B, it doesn't mean that that family has been continuously resident for those 200 years. There's nothing wrong with tracking that, there's nothing wrong with measuring that, but it's a different set of research if you're looking for continuously resident families, which is actually what this little chart is. Those families are the ones that were there at the beginning of their horizontal line, were the same with the ancestors are the ones that are there at the end of the horizontal line. Please don't ask me how I produced that chart, because I've slept since then and I really can't remember, but there must be a way of it. Was done using it wasn't done using Excel, it was done using a Microsoft spreadsheet, and I wish I could remember what to do, but unfortunately I can't. But there are other ways of illustrating how persistent a particular surname is, and this was done for 3 different places, where it's no good saying, oh, 10 surnames are in the place for more than 60 years, when you don't know what 10 surnames represents. There might only be 11 families in your place, so if it's 10 out of 11 surnames, it's a bit of a different picture to if it's 10 out of 300 surnames, which is why I've done this as a percentage. So for the place that's got the red bar, Bucks Mills, this is a place where basically nobody moves ever, practically, so that I found that 10% of all the surnames that I was dealing with were in that place for more than 60 years. So you're looking really into a 3rd generation, really. So that's just something else you might decide to do. And you can look at this in different ways. You can look at this in the way that I have on the 2 charts I've shown you already, which is from the point of view of families or surnames, but you can also look at it from the point of view of individuals. This is individual people now, and I'm looking at how many people remain from one census to the next in these various places. Of course, some people would love to have remained, but they're dead, so they can't. But that's going to affect every place. So I've looked at how many people who were there in 1841 are still there in 1851. In the case of Bucks Mills, it's 57%. And you can see that compared to the other places, that was particularly high. So that was just a little game I played with a few figures. What I was really trying to do as part of this was to identify what I call the dynastic families, the key families that we've all got in our places that appear to stay there for several generations. And sometimes that's why we've chosen our place, because those particular families, maybe they're our ancestors. And this is really a similar study, but showing it in a little bit of a different way. So it's how many people from one census are still there in the next one. And you can see some very, very different patterns there for different places. And again, the little hamlet of fishing hamlet of Bucks Mills comes out as being particularly stagnant as regards movement there. It does make it quite easy to trace my migrants, though, because if 60% of the population aren't going anywhere, there aren't quite so many, unlike Kim, to pick up. So this is now how many people stay there for more than 10 years. Now, the key way of doing this for most of us is to use a census. If your place is in Australia, you're going to have to find a different way of doing this, perhaps musters or directories or something like this. But the problem with these once every decade snapshots is that actually somebody can be in one census and you don't know whether they spent a day in the parish or nearly 20 years, because if they just arrive after one census and they leave just before the one after next, they're in that parish for 19 years, 360 days, but they're still only going to appear in one census. So that is a bit of a problem. What I've been able to do, because my places are fairly small, is actually track lifelong migrations of people. So for many of them, I do know how long they were in the parish, not just how many censuses they appear in, although this is done with a variety of sources here. And again, the red column, which is Bucks Mills, will show you that these are the people who are, as individuals, not just as families, who are staying and staying and staying. And then I wanted to try and work out whether there was something in particular about these people that was making them stay, and how they were different perhaps from the people who weren't staying, and what made a difference to that decision to stay. Was it just because they were unadventurous and boring, or was there something else going on? And I came to some conclusions. I'm not sure I came to hard and fast conclusions. First of all, I tried to decide whether men or women were more likely to stay. So the first figure is the men and the second figure is women. And it seems that you're more likely to stay if you're a man. And that perhaps makes sense because you're the one that's got the job. And if you're a woman and you marry, then you may get married in your home parish, but you're probably going to move to the place where your husband lives because he's the one that's got the job. So there wasn't any surprises there. And then I looked at land ownership, and I did discover that those that were owner-occupiers, and I don't have very many of those, but they were the ones that stayed, not just as individuals but as families, because obviously these properties were passing down, and these are 4 out of 5 of them, they only went when they died, and the other one, I don't quite know what happened to him, but he was there for a jolly long time as well. But these are all my owner-occupiers. There aren't any other owner-occupiers, and they're all there for a reasonably long time. And then I looked at where these people had come from, and again, probably not unexpectedly, it tends to be you're either somebody who moves about a lot or you're somebody who stays put. So if I looked at place of birth, I was finding that those who'd moved might well move on again. If you've been born in that particular place, you were more likely to stay put. And again, to say no surprises there. And the final thing I looked at really was, does it make a difference if you've got family in the parish? Does that, or the place, does that mean that you're more inclined to feel you're rooted there, you've got a support network there, and you're going to stay? And the answer basically is yes, it does. There was a difference in my research between somebody who's related, and of course that can be somebody who has a different surname. So this involved creating a massive great family tree so I could see who was related through the female line, with everybody in the parish on it somewhere, even if I couldn't actually link them to anybody. And I was looking at if it made a difference if you were one of my core families, what I called the core kin, the ones with the dynastic families. And if you were related to one of those families, even if that wasn't your surname, it did seem to be that made a real difference to how likely you were to stay put. And none of these, if you're new to this idea of a shared project, you don't have to do everything we've done. We're just putting out ideas. Some will be relevant to your place, some won't. You're more than welcome to compare your findings with our findings, because to me that's what makes it interesting. here we are, the percentage of individuals from the persistent families who remain compared to the total population. So these are the ones that don't stay for very long, and you can see the total population is more likely to move than the ones from these persistent families. So that seemed to apply in all the places that I studied in this way. And there's another way of showing not just what happens if you haven't got any relatives and basically you don't stay very long, but the difference between just ordinary relatives and these core families, which are the yellow columns there. And you can see that you're more likely to stay for longer if you've got a really dense kinship network. If you want to see more on staying put, one of our members, Lynn Boothman, is coming to talk to us about that over a very long period of time in her place in Long Melford in Suffolk. So we're all looking forward to that on the 21st of November. And she's also had an article on the same topic in Local Population Studies. If you want to read more about mine, that's available online as well. And if you go to the resources sheet for the shared Endeavour on our website, then the proper links to both Lynn's article and to my findings are there for anyone to look at. I'm now going to unscreen share, so if you just excuse me while I fiddle about for a minute and come back to you somehow. And there you are. Right. Now we've come to the end of what we wanted to share, we'd like to invite Susie and Roz to speak to us. We know there's people out there who you can't see because it tells us at the bottom of the page, but
I don't know where to start, to be honest. I don't know how you've done all that. There's
over a very long time, I think, is probably the answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't start this in January, so I'm cheating a little bit in that this was something that I've been working on for 6 years before we started. So this is not something that I've done overnight.
I was waiting for you to fess up, Janet.
Yes. It's a bit daunting in as much as I've got hundreds of surnames where they might actually be the same surname, but they're all spelt differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so they may or they may not be the same family. And until you've actually done everybody, you can't tell.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And I think the other thing that Kim and I have both done here is make it look highly statistical. And if you're not into statistics, you're probably thinking that's about as interesting as watching the grass grow. But in fact, what we've also both done, which we've not made it quite so clear here because we're just sharing a little bit, is look at people. And some of you will know it's something that I do quite a lot of, is to look at individuals' biographical stories. And I've tried to bring these people to life a little bit. So I've chosen in particular those who went overseas. And I've tried to find out what their life was like beforehand, who they went with, when they went, what ship they went on, where they turned up, what's going on in the place where they turn up that might have made them decide to move there. So that brings the human element in, and I think you need the statistics, which tend to be a more overall picture, and then you need the individual stories as well, because that's what really helps you to understand what's going on at an individual level.
But that can be hard too, so I agree, and Janet's got some wonderful stories of those bronze up in Bucks Mills and stuff, and just seems to know everything about them. But she also has been much more successful than me at finding memoirs, letters, personal information on people. And I have, at the conference, we'll talk more about the immigrants, which it's a funny thing, but people tend to put more stories out about those immigrants for some reason that you can kind of Google and find, or that you might get contacted because there's so many people studying family history in the States and Canada where a lot of my immigrants went. but it's very difficult to find that personal information and really picture the individual based on the kind of records that I mostly have access to. But I will say, Susie, just to be a little encouraging, I have not had to build, I haven't yet built a family tree, per se, for my place. Well, I did find, especially for the 1841 census, I found it very difficult until I was looking at baptism records as well as census records, and I am very fortunate that both Devon and Cornwall have those records, those parish registers available online county-wide. But I did find their parents to try and figure out and distinguish them from the other John Rices or whoever. But I did not go any further than that at this point. And because of that, I can't answer nearly the kind of questions that Janet is able to on kinship relationships. And I think that's something in the future I'd like to do, but it's certainly not something that I've tried to approach at this point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've tried to, even just counting surnames. I mean, I love statistics, so I love what you do with the graphs and the charts. But even just trying to get a graph just of my surnames, there is, well, thousands. And even though I try grouping them, so for instance, if you take a simple name of Abbott, sometimes it's spelt with one B, sometimes two B's, sometimes one T, sometimes two T's. That's just a very simple one. I pretend that they're all the same spelling and therefore all the same family until I know otherwise. So I would count that as one surname.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, if I'm trying to use any sort of automated counting, it's almost impossible to actually put numbers on that.
Yeah. I think you probably got to do what Kim did and start with a small date span, because when you look at the whole task, it does seem ridiculously overwhelming. And I mean, clearly the gap between two censuses is a, well, I hesitate to say easy one, but it's an obvious place to start, because it's very easy then to get, particularly if you don't do what Kim did and start in 1841. If you start in 1851 to 61 first, because you can always go back to 1841, then at least you've got the birthplaces of your baseline in 1851 to start off with, and you've got fewer people to deal with, and then you build up gradually, and it may be that if there's something strange is happening to the population in your place between 1881 and 1891, then that's the gap you look at. I mean, I understand why Kim started in 41, because that was what her overall population graph flagged up as the sudden drop. So clearly it was important for her to start at that date. But for other people, it might be different times that would be better.
And I think there's even there's a couple things. One, my recollection, I could be wrong, is that you're studying a place, but it includes a number of surrounding smaller places. Is that correct?
I have included some other places, the surrounding villages, because Debenham, for instance, was the main place of work.
Right.
So the Winston and Kenton and Aspel.
So one thing you might consider is just pick up one of those smaller places to start with. You know, if you're trying to start, see what you can do with that. And then I recognize they probably move to and from those other places, but you know, it gives you a manageable amount. The other thing, another thought is, and I'm preparing a article for the next destination issue on a little study I did like this, where I actually only looked at one census in this place I'm going to write about, Ashford, and I really, rather than using linkage to kind of find migration by the decade, I used birthplaces. and that's readily available, and you can stick with one census. And I just looked at everybody in Ashford, and Ashford's actually pretty big. I don't know, I think it has like maybe a couple thousand people off the top of my head or something. But I just picked that up from one census, took everybody who wasn't born in Ashford, and started tracking down their stories and looked at where they came from originally. And they may have moved 50 times, for all I know, before they got to Ashford. But it told me an awful lot about the people. And that was with no census linkage. That was really allowing me to focus very quickly on who were these people and start looking at their characteristics and finding out why this kind of group might have come from far away and this kind of group might have come from close by. So I'd look at their occupations, their ages, and where their spouses came from and things like that. So that's another idea, because I must say there are automated ways of doing things like census linkage, but everything I've read about it, they're pretty weak. There's a lot of problems with trying to automate it, and what I found was I did much better. It takes time, but I did much better with doing it manually and then checking it afterwards to see, does it make sense what I linked, rather than trying to find cheap ways to automate and match up all those people, because the records just are not that cooperative.
Yeah, it's a bit like the little leaves you get, that tell you they've found someone you're related to, and it just means it's someone the right name and probably completely the wrong person. So, and I think automated linkage is all very well, but you probably spend longer checking it and ruling out the rubbish than you would spend if you did the whole thing manually on your own behalf.
Sorry.
Carry on.
I tend to concentrate mainly on Debenham because I've got handwritten transcripts of all the parish registers, so baptisms and the marriages and the burials. But I think you're probably right, Kim. If I look at one of my smaller parishes like Aspel, even today there's only 37 houses in Aspel, so that would actually make it a lot more manageable. And if I just take the census data, because I don't have any transcripts for those, and just base it on censuses.
And a good idea about starting with a small place is you can sort of learn the techniques on a small place and then go on to apply it to a bigger place when you've sort of got the wrinkles ironed out, because there are different ways of doing it, and as Kim pointed out, you can compare birthplace to where they are now and do lots of lovely maps about how far they've come and arrows and goodness knows what else. But that's a completely different exercise to looking at where they've just come from, because as she said, they could have moved 50 times. So you get a different picture if you look at the last known address and before they arrive in your place, and birthplace. Birthplace is much easier to do, which is why most people do it, because there it is written down in the census. And if you want to do last known address, you've pretty much got to trace the histories of each individual person. But I mean, I just get help, which is why I've got all these journals and photos and things. So I look for the descendants of all these people who are tracing their family history, and I contact them and I say, I see you're interested in the so-and-so family. I can tell you all about the place they lived in. Can you tell me all about the family? And it seems to work quite well. In fact, I've just got one today that I was working on and stopped in order to come and join you here. I'm about to go to Canada and give a talk about emigration from here to there, and I was specifically asked to do, I offered to do, what families would you like me to do, and I was given one, and I've just discovered that the online trees are wrong, because although they've got quite an unusual name, there are several people with that unusual name undoubtedly in some way related, but they've married somebody off to 2 wives and he only had one, and I think I can prove it. So, well, either that or he's got completely different. In one, he's got completely different. Well, one he's got a signature and one he's got a mark. He's not mentioned as a widower in the second marriage, and they're both couples having children at the same time. I know he could have set up 2 homes for himself, but I don't think he did.
And Janet, I should have mentioned that too. I can't tell you how valuable the family trees out there have been to me. And I know there's a lot of garbage. I mean, there are wild ones, you know, where the guy's born in, you know, the north of England. He marries in, you know, Devon, and then is in London. I mean, it's just nonsense in some of them. But there's a lot of really good trees and really good researchers out there. And I don't think it's terribly difficult to pretty quickly figure out what kind of tree you're looking at. And then by getting a hold of the person, you get a lot better feel for what kind of researcher they are. I have found out so much. In fact, when I go to do my census linkage, I set up, say, a list of people who were there in 1851 next to people who were there in 1861. And first I look for somebody with the same name or, you know, close in 61. Then I look and try and find a baptism record if I need to kind of distinguish person. And the next thing I do is I go on Ancestry and I see if they're in anybody's tree. And I do that with everybody. And yes, yes, there are mistakes, but I tell you, it's been invaluable. And I have also gotten just brilliant contacts through this migration work because of that, because I'll write, and if I find something that's wrong in a tree that seems like a pretty serious researcher, I write them and let them know, because I'm sure, you know, I'd appreciate the same. I certainly have mistakes in my own trees, and I really appreciate hearing from people when they say, you didn't get this part quite right. And I have gotten some brilliant contacts who I'm still working with now and learning so much from. Besides the fact that you start to get little tidbits like Janet gets, like, oh, here's some nice pictures, and my Auntie Margaret, you know, wrote this in, you know, 1902, you know, things like that. It's just absolutely brilliant. So, very important part of the research in my book.
Yeah.
Ros, is this something that, I know you haven't been doing your study quite as long as some of the rest of us. Is this something that you are going to do, have done, might like to do?
Well, I certainly haven't done it. And if I started it, I'd have to go back to January.
Oh yeah,
6 years or something like that. Yes, my place, which is South Pool in Devon, does seem like a very small, quiet village. So I've been transcribing the early parish registers from 1665, and I'm beginning to get a feel for the names which crop up again and again and again. So it's becoming more interesting as it's beginning to coalesce as I do various things, but I don't think I'm quite there yet to be able to say, any sort of statistics for migration.
Oh, well, there's no time scale to this. The crib sheets are there on the website for any members to look at, and we're not planning on taking them away. So if you're ready to start in 5 years' time, you just pick up and do the bits that will suit you at that point in time. Something we didn't show, which is the sort of thing that your indexing would allow you to do, Ros, is perhaps to take, let's say, either 25-year chunks or 50-year chunks or 30-year chunks, and then take a surname and almost like five-bar gates. Is it in this half century? Is it in that half century? Is it in the other half century? And then you get a period. If you keep the chunks at say about 30 years, which is a generation, and you suddenly get a gap, then you start, and there's no baptisms or marriages or burials for that surname in 30 years, you start to think that perhaps this is an indication that that family has left, even if they come back again. So it does give you quite a good picture of longevity of families, even if you haven't yet tried to really prove that the abbot, as Susie said, in 1700 is actually related to the abbot in 1800.
And Roz, you say your place is a really quiet place. I'm just saying, my place seems a really quiet place. I mean, it's still got the same farm names it had in the 1300s. I mean, even today. And but when I got to looking, I had a suspicion something was going on because my surnames are very diverse. Okay, there's not many people with the same surname in my place, so very few cases, and certainly nothing like some of the stuff that Janet's seen in her places. And I thought, well, what is that? This is a little parish, you know, about 500 people or so in any given census nowadays, but there is just a massive amount of local movement. And in the period that I looked at so far, at least 15% of the people who were moving into the parish had been born into the parish, so they'd been elsewhere and they'd come back. But so it's a lot of very local movement, and they may circle around, but these people, nobody was standing still. It's almost like looking at a place where you hardly know what the boundaries are. And I have a part of the parish kind of down in the southwest of the parish where even in the census you can tell people were actually confused about where they lived. Part of the people said they lived in Broadwood Widger. They didn't. They lived in Bratton Covelli. You know, they didn't really know. The village of Broadwood Widger was actually closer to their homes than the village of Bratton Covelli. So a lot of movement, and you may find, and I suspect you will find, because I think you're near the coast, right? Your place is near the coast.
Well, yeah, it's on a creek, which leads out very close, you know, to the sea. It's very close.
Yeah, so I think you may find even more. I'm just been amazed at the amount of movement, and I think it was going on long before 1841, because even when I looked at 1841, something like half the people in the parish had not been born in it. So this was not something that started in 1841 either.
Yeah.
No, and I think that's the frustrating thing, is that it's so much more difficult to trace it with any kind of meaning before you've got census returns. It's so much harder. In the same way as it's harder to be sure that you've got the right John Smith as you go back into the 1700s, because you might find a John Smith, but you might find 4 John Smiths, and which one's yours?
I'd be really interested to hear from people who've tried to look at movement, and I'll be very interested in Lynn's pitch on the 1800s.
Yeah.
But I would say, I was just looking at the manor rolls for Bratton Covelli, and the 1407, there's not many rolls, but the 1407 rolls actually have a list of people that is referred to as unfree tenants, and a number of them are marked saying moved out of the country, which in the manor roll actually means moved off the manor, or they might have said moved out of the county or country, and I think that means, you know, left the manor, so you're kind of a foreigner then. And I was amazed at how many, and they looked to be the young adults, the young sons, and whose parents were in the rolls, and then they had been brought into the court by their parents, and then showed that they had left. So there are ways to get at some of the information. But right now, I think I'm going to have my hands full ever getting to 1911, and I am plugging away at 1861 to 71 now, and I just can't wait to see what else happens to this parish through the rest of the census years. Then I'll worry about how I deal with some of the other years.
Right. Well, we are coming up to our hour. We don't all turn into pumpkins, of course, but we don't want to go on forever. So I just ask if anyone would like to add anything else. Susie, anything else you'd like to comment on or add?
No, thank you.
Roz?
Thank you.
Kim, anything else you'd like to?
I just say, please, if you're really interested in what others are finding, however far along you are, and whatever approach you're taking, whatever group you're looking at, and if you can share some of that on the forum or on the Google Drive, however you want to do it, it would really be great to see some of these things, because I find that every time I hear about somebody else's study, it gives me a lot more questions and a lot more ideas of what I need to consider further in mind. For example, this stuff that Janet looked at on the kinship is really interesting, and we'll talk more about that on our overseas immigrants. The stuff that Lynn and Janet talked about on stayers, I've got information on my stayers, but I haven't taken a specific look at the people staying. I've been so busy with the people who moved. So anything that people want to share would be greatly appreciated.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining in. Thank you to those who are watching who aren't in the room, and those. Thank you in advance to those who are going to be watching us later. And there will be one final migration hangout on air, I think probably towards the end of the year. And if you haven't contributed to this one, then maybe you'll feel ready to contribute something to that one. So I will say thank you very much, and Susie will end our live broadcast now.
Thank you, Janet.